joining us for this special program. Today, we will delve into the life of Mr. E. Frederic Morrow, the first African-American to serve as a member of the White House Executive Staff. We welcome Dr. Michael Berkner of Gettysburg College, Mr. Philip Cunningham of the Amistad Research Center, and Dr. John Morrow of the University of Georgia, and nephew of Mr. Frederic Morrow, who has joined us. So to get things started, Dr. Morrow, will you please introduce yourself?
I'm Uncle Fred's nephew by his closest brother, John Howard Morrow, who was born literally 10 months after Fred was born. And Fred was the third child of the family, and John was the fourth. So that's a quick introduction. Do you want me to launch into his early years at this point?
You can, or you can introduce Philip and Dr. Berkner really quick.
I think that would be better. I have Michael Berkner here, with whom I've been in touch for a number of years, who has researched and written a good bit about Fred Morrow because of his interest in that region. He comes from the area. And so it's always a pleasure to be with Michael. And I just recently met Philip. Michael is at Gettysburg College. He's a professor of history at Gettysburg who's written numerous books and articles. And Philip Cunningham is actually the head of research services at the Amistad Research Center at Tulane University, which is where Uncle Fred left a number of his materials. There are a few other places. So these two gentlemen are very knowledgeable about Uncle Fred. I probably should say more knowledgeable than I am, because I'm merely the nephew. I give the personal aspects of this. I am a historian, but I work in the history of war and society. So I'm looking forward very much to this time today, because I anticipate learning a great deal about my own uncle. So it's a pleasure to be here. Everett Frederic Morrow was born in 1909 in Hackensack, New Jersey. It's in North Jersey. It's about 4 or 5 miles across what is now the George Washington Bridge from New York City. But then they had ferries. And Hackensack was very much of an ethnic town. I wasn't born until 1944, so no one should be deluded that I was around in their early years. But the family was born, the first child was born early in the century, and then Fred and John came along after their oldest sister, Nellie Morrow, and then Fred, John, and then 10 years later, William. And it was a family born to a very poor minister who was a janitor. He was a minister of the AME Church, and we were all raised in the AME Church. And he had a church in Closter, which was not too far away. But during the week, he was a janitor in Hackensack. But I think one of the things I take from John Eugene Morrow and Mary Ann Morrow was that the grandfather, my grandfather, was a man who emphasized excellence, education, and was unafraid to take a stand. He was highly respected. In fact, when Nellie Morrow was about to become the first Black teacher in that area of North Jersey, after graduating from what was then Montclair Teachers College, there were threats that the Klan would march in front of their very small house. And my grandfather, while he was a minister, marched down to the sheriff's office, and he knew the sheriff was actually the head of the KKK in Hackensack. and said that while he was a man of God, he also had a pistol. If the Klan dared to march in front of his small house to prevent his daughter from becoming a teacher, he would use the pistol. The Klan didn't march. Aunt Nellie went on to become a very celebrated and loved teacher in the area. There is now an elementary school named for her in what used to be the white section of Hackensack. Fred comes along afterward, and Fred noted, and their house was very small. As Michael has pointed out, it's on what used to be an estate of a very wealthy white man. And in those years, it was gradually changing. The houses that came up around it were 2 and 3 stories. And by the time I came along, it was an all-black neighborhood, but it was changing in those early years. And what you have to understand, and Fred wrote this book way down south up north, was that growing up in New Jersey, south of Jersey was even worse. The area around Princeton was actually like the deep south. But in Hackensack, there was racial stratification, segregation, discrimination. But the interesting thing about it was that all of the children in Hackensack, when they reached high school, went to high school together. So the high school was integrated. Fred was an outstanding debater. He was very polished. He was a very polished and diplomatic man. His younger brother, my father, tended to be the roughneck of the family, but brilliant. He would go on to Rutgers and then to Penn to get a doctorate in Romance languages and become a professor and later a diplomat. But Fred, from the very start, was, as I always remember, when I knew him, an elegant dresser, well-spoken, very sharp in debate, which is why he became a lawyer. But when he finished Hackensack High as president of the debate club, he applied to Bowdoin College. And I will just tell this one anecdote because I think it's a classic one of the time. Colleges in those years in the Northeast, and Bowdoin was in Maine, Brunswick, Maine, usually only admitted one black student. But Uncle Fred, in applying, the last name Morrow in the era of those years was associated with the Honorable Dwight Morrow, who was a white financier and lawyer who was a power on Wall Street, a senior partner in J.P. Morgan, international financier and national figure in the Republican Party. And it turned out that the admissions officer at Bowdoin had gone to college with Dwight Morrow at Amherst. And so when they saw Morrow, apparently they didn't think anything else. They thought, oh, this must be Dwight Morrow's scion. We'll bring him up here. And so Uncle Fred rides up on the train to Brunswick, Maine. And when he gets there are all these chanting, some of them are football players, they have leather sweaters on, and they're all saying, Morrow, Morrow, Morrow. Well, as the white students get off the train, each of them gets asked by these cheering characters, are you Morrow? And they aren't. And so by the time Fred gets off, they know he's not Morrow. And Uncle Fred remembered, he said there was this very muscular fellow who must have been a football player saying, I guess Morrow didn't make the train. So he goes to the Bowdoin campus, and immediately in confronting the bursar says to him, you were just here. What are you doing back? And he said, man, I just got on campus. Well, it turned out that his fellow black student, William Dean, who was brilliant, had already registered, and we all know that all black people look alike, so she thought Fred was dean. Well, they sorted it out, and on he went to Bowdoin. But that's one of the stories that he always told, and it indicates that in those times, if you were going to do or achieve, his book is one of his books is 40 Years of Guinea Pig, because you were always out in the vanguard, often alone and with little support. But he went on to Bowdoin, and my father won the state scholarship to Rutgers next year, so he went to Rutgers. But after Fred finished Bowdoin, he began to get involved very much in civil rights, which was very logical at the time. He was highly motivated about it. He had experience growing up in Jersey, the pricks of segregation and so on. And so he was affiliated with the Urban League, initially as one of its publishers, a writer for their the Blurb, and then he went on to become a field lawyer with the NAACP, field secretary, one of those folks like Thurgood Marshall, who spent time traveling around the South helping black people form NAACP branches. And he did that until he was drafted in 1942 by the U.S. Army. Well, his youngest brother, William, had already dropped out of college, dropped out of Lincoln University, and joined the Army in 1940. His older brothers could have killed him, but he told them there was a big war coming and he wasn't going to miss it. And the oldest brother, Gene, whose vision was very poor and ultimately went blind early in life and hoped to fight in World War I. Well, the youngest brother fought in World War II. Fred, after being drafted, the Army came to understand, we've got a lawyer. So he quickly went up from private to sergeant, and he ended up a major in the artillery, which to me, I never thought very much about it growing up. I just have this great photo of, as my father didn't go because he had two kids, myself and my older sister, but my son deployed to Iraq with this great photo of Uncle William as an infantry lieutenant and Uncle Fred as an artillery major. And I kept thinking, why didn't Fred deploy? And I realized, because I teach war in society later on, that there was no way they could have deployed a black artillery major, because in the Army at that time, and this will give you a sense of the period, no black man could command a white man, regardless of rank. And as an artillery major, he would have automatically been superior to the white captains in all the deployed units of artillery. So he spent the war in the United States. It's discharged in 1946. We have a photo or two of him in military uniform, but it's probably a guard or reserves uniform, because it's infantry and he wasn't infantry. But I'm going to leave it at that, because that sort of sets you up. You understand that he served in the Army in World War II, which is very important, whether he was deployed or not. His background, Bowdoin, Rutgers Law School, and the thing I always think about, as I said, when I first met him, because I grew up in the South. My father went south to teach at historically black colleges and universities, but we would usually meet him in the North when we would go up to spend the summer in Hackensack at the family home. And that was when I got a chance to talk with him and listen to him. And when the Morrow men got together, it was absolutely uproarious, because they're all fantastic storytellers. So I was regaled with all these stories, sitting around often in language that my mother would say, you know, you shouldn't let the little picture over there hear those big words. And I thought, hey, this is good. I'll absorb them all and I'll go away with a good education from these fellows. So they were a very close-knit family, and they emphasized excellence and education, all the things that they passed on to me. And I have always appreciated it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Berkner.
I wanted to pick up where John left us here with a good foundation. But before I say what I want to say about Fred post-World War II, I want to make two quick comments. The first one has to do with John Morrow. He was very skimpy in relating his own background. This man is one of our leading military historians, and you can look him up on the sheet announcing this program or Google him, and you will see that John is in the top tier of scholarly figures doing military history. The second thing I wanted to say was that there's one anecdote that is worth mentioning about the Morrow family, and I think it connects to John's last comment about their aspirations and their commitment to excellence. Fred's father and John's father, grandfather, Fred's father was a janitor at the Johnson Free Public Library in Hackensack. And one of the perks he felt for being an employee there was that his kids could have access to the library. And Fred relates this in a memoir, and it's really a telling story because it tells you about the sense of white superiority at that time, even in North Jersey. And that was that when the kids, including Fred and I suspect John's father, went into the library to take out books, they were discouraged by the librarian who said this was all too complicated for their brains, that this was something that they should not be doing. But they didn't listen to her. Fred's father insisted on them checking out the books. And I think that really says something about that commitment, and it says something about that family's, again, aspirations. And of course, look at what they did as each of those kids in many ways excelled. So Fred comes out of World War II, having served his country, goes back to the NAACP, where he does really significant work, and I would say dangerous work, because he is sent as field secretary into places like Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. I've been through the papers of the NAACP, and there are some pretty hairy moments for him, because let's face it, the NAACP was not popular with the white power structure in the Deep South. But Fred did his duty and, was respected for that. He did not always get along with other honchos at the NAACP, including the two top dogs there, Walter White and Roy Wilkins. And because they had issues that really I don't even know the specifics of them, but they were colliding a fair amount, Fred decided he would plot his course elsewhere and went over to CBS News, where he did a lot of writing for CBS on different projects, including some documentaries. And it was at CBS News that he was working when he got tapped to join the Eisenhower presidential campaign in the summer of 1952. If you look at the writing about this subject, there are a number of different tales told about how it is that Fred came to work for the Eisenhower campaign. My own take on it is that the leaders of the Eisenhower campaign realized that there had to be outreach to African-American voters. And they needed someone who could do that effectively and who could get along with people on the campaign train and on the campaign plane. It happened that one of Eisenhower's advisors was the governor of New Jersey at the time, and Alfred Driscoll was his name. And Alfred Driscoll was a racial progressive, and he knew that Fred had been involved in Republican affairs in Bergen County, New Jersey for a number of years as a young Republican leader. And so he contacted Sherman Adams, as best I can figure it out. Sherman Adams was managing Eisenhower's campaign as of the summer of 1952. And Sherman Adams, who also was a racial progressive, as was Driscoll, was very pleased at this, and he got Fred the credentials he needed to get onto the train. Fred served on that campaign train. I think you could say it was one of the great experiences of his life. He even got a couple of one-on-one sessions with Eisenhower, and he had the temerity at one point to critique a speech that Eisenhower gave and suggest that it was not what he needed to say to reach average people. And I think that says something about Fred also, that a very junior member of the staff would tell the commander of European forces of the Allied nations in World War II and a presidential candidate that he could up his game as a speaker. But he did say that, and Eisenhower seems to have taken it with good grace. The campaign, as you know, had some exciting moments, including the famous Nixon fund crisis. And on the whole, though, it was an exciting, exuberant experience because the country was ready for change after 20 years of Democrats in power. And so Eisenhower wins decisively in November of 1952. At some point, whether during the campaign or shortly thereafter, Sherman Adams told Fred that he could expect an appointment in the White House. And Fred, of course, was very interested in this. He was well aware of what this meant for the Black community in the United States, to have someone on the executive staff of the President of the United States. And so when Adams gave him this word, Fred quit his job at CBS News, waiting for the call for what exactly his assignment would be. And the call did not come. Worse, as January approached and the call didn't come, he began making calls. Eisenhower's inaugurated. He's not able to get through. He's not able to get through. Finally, it took a couple of months into the Eisenhower administration for a senior staffer to call him and say there would be no appointment, which was a crushing blow. Now, I don't know that anybody has figured out the exact dynamic here, but I will give you my take on it. I think Sherman Adams wanted Fred Morrow on the White House staff, but he had not secured himself as the prime mover among the staff at that point that he could demand that this happen. There was a Southerner who had a very high rank on the staff. His name was Jerry Persons. He was an Alabamian. His brother was a very prominent segregationist politician and later governor of Alabama. And Jerry Persons, according to Fred's account and others, made it clear that if a Black man was appointed to the executive staff in the White House, he would walk. And he had been Eisenhower's congressional liaison during the military years and was going to have the same role in Eisenhower's presidency. He was considered a valuable player, and nobody really could essentially deny Pearson his way. So no offer was made. Now, what happens next is I think Sherman Adams felt really bad about this, and he talked to the Secretary of Commerce, a man named Sinclair Weeks from Massachusetts, and he said, I'm in a jam here. I made a promise. I didn't keep my promise. I got to do something so that this young man, he's referring to Fred, will be able to come to Washington and keep his head high. And so there's an appointment made for Fred as a business affairs advisor in the Department of Commerce. And that's why Fred is able to move to Washington in the middle of 1953 and take on that role. Obviously, not exactly what he had in mind, but something decent. He does that for a couple of years, and according to his own account, he did well and liked it well enough. But of course, he was looking for something step up, and he gets the call finally in the summer of 55 when Adams has assured his own status as the #1 aide to Eisenhower, and Adams is able to bring him into the White House. Now, I want to take a moment and say something to you about the Eisenhower White House staff, because I think you can only appreciate Fred's role there unless you understand the broader issue of the staff. It was a very cohesive staff of about 30, mostly white men. And Fred is a very junior member of that staff. That said, by and large, I don't think if you study the history of White House staffs, you will find a more amiable, cohesive group. And that was partly because of Adams running a tight ship, but at the same time giving his staff a lot of leeway, delegating responsibilities because he trusted them to do what they needed to do, which of course was Eisenhower's mantra always: delegate, Get the right people in the jobs, delegate, trust until you have reason not to trust. Adams worked on the same premise. Now, Fred, again, is on the lower end of the staff in terms of his status, but it's still, he's on the staff and he has access to everything that everybody else has because they have staff meetings every day. Now, let me add something else here. Fred did not want to enter the White House staff with a portfolio of African American affairs. He was very proud. He wanted to have a portfolio that was broader. And so he gets appointed to special projects. And special projects is an amorphous responsibility, but basically, as I read it, it's everything that doesn't fall under somebody else's tab you are responsible to do. A good example of what Fred would have to do is when a White House commission was established to study a health issue or an education issue or a national security issue, and they brought in experts, such as they would in 1957 after Sputnik. It was Fred's job to find the space, the furnishings, and all of the accoutrements to make the staff function effectively, to make the commissioners function effectively. But here's the thing. Think of the date when Fred joins the White House. Summer of '55. Why is that significant? Well, there's something called the Montgomery bus boycott going on at that time. There's an incident in Mississippi in which a young black teenager is brutally maimed and murdered by Southern segregationists for having either whistled at or just said bye baby to a white woman in a shoe store. And of course, you've got the implications of Brown versus Board of Education playing out and Southerners' insistence on massive resistance to Brown v. Board. So things are percolating on civil rights. Inevitably, Fred is going to get drawn into this. And he is, of course, not reluctant since he has the portfolio of special projects. He wants to be helpful in, I think, raising the consciousness of the Eisenhower administration about the importance of this issue of civil rights. And he is going almost immediately to suggest that the Eisenhower team bring in black leaders to talk about what can be done to advance the cause of civil rights. He's ahead of his time. He tries this in '55 and '56 and he gets no traction, but he has put the idea on their plate. By 1958, when a lot has happened, including, of course, the 1957 Civil Rights Act and the Little Rock incident, the time seems ready. And Adams decides that, yes, we will arrange a meeting of African-American leaders with the President of the United States in the Oval Office. Now, interestingly enough, Adams does not give Fred the main responsibility for making this happen. He says, Fred, you're going to help us around the edges, but the guy who's going to organize it is the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Rocco Siciliano. And Siciliano has written a lot about this in his memoirs. Siciliano gets it mostly right about how the meeting with Eisenhower went on. He doesn't get it quite right when he describes the meeting itself. The meeting occurred on June 23rd, 1958. Fred was there. He's pictured. You'll see the picture when Philip does his presentation in a minute. The meeting started off cool but cordial. It went a little bit sideways because the Attorney General at the time, who was generally pro-civil rights, his name was William Rogers, made a kind of, I think, gauche comment that African-American leaders ought to be more appreciative of all the good things that Eisenhower had done for them. And I think they were looking at it from the other end of the telescope. I think that they saw some progress under Eisenhower. He had integrated Washington, D.C. He had integrated the military. He had integrated military facilities around the country for educational and other purposes. But he hadn't really shown any moral leadership on the issue of civil rights. And they were looking for a bit of that. So that kind of got them on edge. And then one of the people who was at the meeting, who was the head of the NAACP, or representing it at the time, Lester Granger, referred to how black people felt kind of bitter at the slow progress of civil rights. And before he could finish his sentence, Eisenhower got really curt with him and basically was about to, I think, terminate the meeting. This is not in in Rocco Siciliano's account, because he feels put upon. Now, how could these people say that about me? I've been doing the right thing. Fortunately, Granger is able to finish his sentence and say, Mr. President, you're misunderstanding me. I am talking about Southern defiance of your programs and of the Supreme Court. I'm not talking about you, sir. That eased the situation a bit. They went on for an extra 20 minutes and went out for photo ops and positive conversation. Let me add something here. If you look at one of the books that Fred wrote in his post-White House years, and Philip will probably refer to them, one of them is a revised diary of his White House years. And oddly enough, I consulted the diary just last night to be sure I had this right. Fred has almost nothing to say about the meeting, except that it was a big success and it reflected Eisenhower's kindness and generosity. So I really don't exactly know what was going on in his writing that, because Fred was a person who was trying his best to get Eisenhower to be a little bit more proactive for civil rights. And before I close, let me say a couple things. Number one, Fred was in a very tough place in the White House as the only African-American executive branch officer. He is in many ways pushing too hard for the members of the Eisenhower administration. They don't want to hear Fred say, we need to do, because we're not doing enough. And at the same time, he's viewed by civil rights leaders, like Roy Wilkins, for example, as not pushing hard enough. They see him as getting along and defending Eisenhower too forcefully when Eisenhower didn't deserve it in the mind of Roy Wilkins and other civil rights activists. So Fred is in a kind of no man's land, and I think he did the best he could under those circumstances to keep his integrity and also to keep lines of conversation going. He does do some things that, in retrospect, you think he did these as defensive actions, as in when he makes it clear he doesn't want Harry Belafonte to come to the White House to present a young people's petition to the president or to president's representative. He sees Belafonte as some kind of a prima donna. Well, I think Harry Belafonte was a great civil rights leader, and that was unfortunate. But Fred is trying to navigate very treacherous waters. The second thing I want to say about Fred's term in the White House, and this will be toward the wrap-up here, is that when Sherman Adams leaves the White House shortly after that famous meeting with the black leaders, Fred loses a good deal of his standing in the White House, his ability to navigate. Adams had been very pro-civil rights and had a kind of avuncular relationship with with Fred. Fred viewed Adams as a dear person to him, and he was. But Adams is gone because of a scandal involving a Vacuna Code and other gifts that he'd taken from a sleazy industrialist named Bernard Goldfein. So who replaces Adams? Well, wouldn't you know it? It's Jerry Persons, the segregationist from Alabama. And he makes it very clear to Fred on taking office that he's not interested in talking to Fred about civil rights, and he's not interested in talking about civil rights, period, and that Fred, if he wants to bring up any issues, can go through somebody else. And that was discouraging in the extreme, because the momentum that Fred thought had been building into that meeting in the White House is now essentially thwarted. And he is not sure whether he should stick it out or should look for a job in the private sector. He talks to Sherman Adams when Adams is in retirement about it. Adams says, I'll help you any way you want me to help you. But he sticks it out. He thought perhaps there would be a revival of interest in civil rights if Richard Nixon was elected president, because Nixon had been pro-civil rights during the Eisenhower years. But Nixon and his people were looking for votes in the South in 1960, and they were not that interested in Fred's advocacy of Nixon as a civil rights paragon. Interestingly enough, Fred must have really felt dismayed to realize that the Nixon he thought he knew was not really the Nixon who had evolved by 1960. And as a consequence, and Nixon loses anyway. But as a consequence, Fred is going to be out, and he will go into the private sector. He will be a notable help to historians by meeting with anybody who wants to talk about those White House years. He writes the 3 books. And I'll just close my comments by saying that he deserves more attention and he deserves more respect, perhaps, than the scholarship has given him, where he always plays a cameo role in almost every book. And he fits whatever argument the historian who's writing the book wants to make, such as Taylor Branch in Parting the Waters. And I think Fred needed to get taken for his own sake. Well, that's what I tried to do in the article that I wrote about him that John refers to. I think that's enough for me, and I'll pass the baton to Philip.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Berkner. I'm going to pick up where he left off and kind of touch upon Fred Morrow's years post-Eisenhower and also his remembrances, memoirs of his time with Eisenhower and his legacy. I'm the head of research services at the Amistad Research Center, which is an independent special collection library and archive that collects, preserves, and makes available material relating to America's ethnic heritage, the history of race relations, and social justice movements. In addition to the Eisenhower Presidential Library, the Amistad Research Center holds a collection of Frederic Morrow's personal papers that document the Eisenhower administration as it relates to business, commerce, civil rights legislation, and the economic conditions for minorities in the southern United States. But I do want to take a quick break to share the slides that we had put together for this presentation. Samantha, if you don't mind sharing that. And I think it's very helpful for people who are unfamiliar with Fred Morrow to at least see what he looks like. So this first image is our friend Fred Morrow here. Here he is speaking at an engagement, speaking on behalf of the Eisenhower administration. The 2 following images are some family photos of him. And this one is really interesting, as we recently learned the very little man sitting at the front of that group photo is actually Dr. John Morrow, who's here with us today. And on the far right, sitting down, is Fred Morrow in military uniform. The image following that is another shot of a very young Fred Morrow in uniform. I'm not certain if this is while he was in World War II or Korea, or maybe later as he was in the U.S. Army Reserve. But those will give you just an idea of this is who we're talking about. Dr. Berkner had mentioned Sherman Adams, one of the main people in the Eisenhower administration and the man who was really instrumental in bringing Fred onto the staff. And then the next couple shots are actually just other interesting things that come from his archival collection. And I apologize for the quality of this. It's not very legible here on the presentation, but this is actually the White House memo that circulated in July of 1955. This was the appointment that Fred Morrow received. It stipulates his annual salary at, I believe, to be about $12,000, a considerable sum for the time. Followed by that is the news clipping naming him as an Eisenhower aide, and this was published. This appeared in the Pittsburgh Courier immediately following that memorandum. Pittsburgh Courier, for anyone unfamiliar, was one of the largest African American newspapers at that time. Though it was stationed out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it actually had a nationwide circulation. This specific news clipping was from the New York edition, where Fred Morrow was living at that time before he moved down to DC to take that appointment. Another slide, another picture of Fred Morrow at his desk. This is in here, this is at the White House in his office. He was given a very spacious office, actually the office that President McKinley had worked in. And he was seen to be very comfortable, at least at the beginning of his appointment. And another thing that Dr. Berkner had mentioned was the iconic meeting with civil rights leaders. And the next slide is the memorandum that circulated among White House staff preparing for that meeting. Once again, I apologize for the quality of this, but it does identify Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, and Lester Granger of the National Urban League on their meeting. Also present, circled in pen, though it's hard to make out, is Fred Morrow's name. It kind of gives the itinerary and agenda for the meeting. The next image beyond that is the photo of that civil rights meeting. Fred Morrow is actually kind of in the back, standing behind Martin Luther King Jr. and President Eisenhower. Second from the far right is Rocco Siciliano. Dr. Berkner mentioned as being kind of the man who took over the reins on leading that meeting. When we talk about Fred Morrow as an agent of civil rights and the civil rights movement, I think we have to understand the incredibly difficult position that he found himself in. And John and Michael have made that very clear. His input, particularly on matters of race relations, something that in the beginning he was not even slotted to be the liaison on, but kind of took on the brunt of that in his time in the White House. They're for the most part ignored by his White House colleagues. And from a perspective outside the administration, he was still seen as one of Ike's closest buddies. And so from the viewpoint of the public and civil rights leaders, if there was ever an agent of change in the federal government on behalf of the African-American community, the idea was that it should be the man working there in an executive capacity. So when those calls and demands are not heard, he is quick to be condemned as someone who is not necessarily our man on the inside of Washington, but rather someone who has unfortunately turned his back on the community. And from what we learn about him and from very much his own writings, we see that that's just simply not true, and that, like very many historical issues, it's much more complex and nuanced than that. That time, no one other than Fred himself could have understood the pressure on all sides that he was feeling. And that's what makes his memoirs and writings in the archival collections, both here at the Amistad Research Center, the Eisenhower Presidential Library, and other institutions so valuable. I want to address the great value held at all of the institutions that hold his personal papers. In addition to the Eisenhower Library, in addition to the Amistad Research Center here in New Orleans, there's a very large collection of personal papers on Fred Morrow held by the special collections at Chicago's Public Library. There's an oral history collection interview with Fred Morrow, I believe done in the 70s, that is a part of the special collections at Columbia University in New York, as well as extensive inclusion of him in the records of the NAACP at the Library of Congress. In those writings and in his papers, he's very candid about his thoughts, especially when writing his speeches, of which he would go on to write and speak hundreds of times, and his 3-book manuscripts. But after editing and omitting certain remarks or memories that could be viewed as inflammatory, especially within the political party, his published thoughts fail to capture the full range of his thoughts and emotions. For most of his speaking engagements, he was expected to speak about his time in the White House in a positive light and defend Eisenhower and his administration. He admired Eisenhower, but the rapport was not always harmonious. Morrow's manuscripts share those insights that would often be removed in later edits. But there's also materials in his collection unrelated to his writings and executive duties that give a humble look at Morrow's personal life. And Samantha, if we can pull the slides up again, a couple more that I wanted to share as just kind of a pass to the American League baseball clubs. Really quickly, she's scrolling through, but those are examples of some of his handwritten and typescript manuscripts for his books. Fred Morrow was a baseball fan, and with the privilege that he received working in the executive office, he had an annual pass to the grounds of all of the American League baseball clubs. That includes the Royals, the Yankees, not the Brooklyn Dodgers. I'm sorry, John. But it kind of just gives a lot of humanness to this historical figure that we're talking about. The next slide is an image of a humorous certificate that he received for having flown in a helicopter. It says, be it known by these contents that E. Frederic Morrow, having for the first time remained motionless in space, flown backwards, forwards, sideways, and vertically over the White House lawn in a U.S. Army helicopter, is hereby designated a genuine super hoverbug. So there were some kind of fun aspects and privileges to working in the White House. And Samantha, I think you can finish sharing with the sharing of those slides. I thank you for that, for helping with that. After leaving Washington, he returned to New York to take a position as the vice president of the African American Institute, a foundation focused on cultural and educational development of newly independent African countries. He was also editing his first book, Black Man in the White House, based on the personal journals he had begun keeping soon after his appointment as an executive assistant. His memoirs once again give praise and admiration to both Sherman Adams, President Eisenhower's, and other White House staff, but he is quick to admit that his role in the White House put him in constant conflict with both civil rights leaders and his colleagues. After Adams left, this is just kind of something to repeat what Dr. Berkner had said, his role stagnated, and honestly, overall, the gears of the entire White House machine slowed with Sherman Adams' departure. Without that support from his colleague and friend, Morrow could have easily left too, but certain factors made that a difficult choice for him to make. He was instilled by his family with a sense of stick-to-itiveness, and his time in the military gave him a duty-first mentality that tells you to see a job to completion. He was brought on to fulfill a special role, and he was not one to shrink from his duties. I think that he also feared that had he left his appointment at the White House, he would not be replaced, and certainly not by another African American. So for those reasons, he wanted to stick it out through the Eisenhower presidency. He also had hope with the run of Vice President Nixon in 1960. He assisted with the presidential campaign, and he found, and compared to Eisenhower, that Nixon was more open to his input, and hoped that a Nixon presidency could solve some of the inefficacies he saw in the Eisenhower administration. Those hopes, once again, were dashed with Nixon's defeat to Kennedy. Soon after the publication of his first book, he will join the Bank of America as a vice president, once again, the first African American to hold such a position. His time in the White House as a liaison between African leaders and diplomats in the executive office, and later his position at the African American Institute, proved to be a valuable asset for the financial institution as the bank looked to new investment and financial opportunities in the emerging African nations. He worked with Bank of America for 10 years, but even a nice job in Lower Manhattan's financial district were shadowed by the years he gave to Eisenhower. A year before his retirement, he published a second book, a more complete autobiography, Way Down South from Up North, where he talks about his life in Hackensack and also his time after the Eisenhower years up to that point, and that was 1973. As soon as that's published, he immediately started working on his third and final memoir, 40 Years of Guinea Pig, which John had mentioned, which would finally be published in 1980. That last book, I would say, gives the most unreserved look into his personal thoughts. He refers to himself as a guinea pig because he is thrown into these positions to improve the atmosphere and develop a climate so that other African Americans might be accepted and follow. It's a very difficult position to be in, and a very large burden to take, but one that he was familiar with and willing to accept. I can't speak to other institutions that hold Fred Morrow's papers, but I do have to admit that his papers here at the Amistad Research Center have not been used by researchers in the 6 years that I have been here. And I think that is unfortunate, because he is an overlooked figure in the civil rights movement, and as Dr. Berkner said, easily dismissed. I want to open the floor back up to John or Michael, and also the public if there's any questions, but I did want to finish real quick by saying that on his shoulders, we all stand, on the shoulder stand subsequent generations of political leaders. And I think one of the finest examples of that is actually General Colin Powell, also a military officer whose entrance into the political realm was as a White House fellow, acting as a special assistant in the White House in 1972 and 73 under Nixon. And 30 years later, he had risen up to general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff before retiring and then serving as Secretary of State under George Bush. And we have to think not just about Morrow as himself, but all these people that have come after him that could not have done it without him taking the helm and taking the lead so early on in the civil rights movement. Now, I don't know, John or Michael, if you have any comments to add.
Thank you very much, both Michael. I think we're all back on now. Myself, I think you highlighted a number of things to me. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, but I remember when we would visit Fred as a family coming from the South, stop in Washington, and he and my father would go for long walks, and I got a chance to tag along. And the thing that struck me quite frequently was Fred's venting of his frustrations to his younger brother. As I said, they were very close. John had taught at HBCUs, but in the late 50s, he became an ambassador, first ambassador to Guinea and then to UNESCO, and experienced these same kinds of, of challenges, being the only Black person on the beat specifically and having to deal with all these matters. But a sense of frustration, but this determination to persevere. And at the same time, I will note that as a young kid, he took me and my father to the White House when I was 11 in 1955, and I met Eisenhower, who was obviously, for any kid that age, the man who led the Allied coalition of World War II. And Ike was a very grandfatherly person, very pleasant. My uncle said, although he appeared to be pleasant, he could whip you into line and tear you a strip, which is what the Army guys would say. Yeah, but the other thing that struck me being in the White House was I ran out and then saw from the back and could determine from the ears that one of my favorite TV stars, Jack Webb, or Joe Friday of Dragnet, was there. So I told my father, ran down the hall. So I had a twofer that day. I met Eisenhower and Joe Friday. Jack Webb was Ike's golfing partner. So he would often come to Washington. But that was one of the nice sides of it. But the struggles really wore on Fred. And by the end of his life, he was quite disillusioned. I remember a conversation that he and my father were having in his New York apartment, and he said, you know, I had hoped that racism, we would be able to defeat racism. We have not, he said. I worry that we will ever be able to defeat it completely. But what those two men instilled in me, and I went back south after I got my degrees in the North, specifically and deliberately because I felt I had a role to play in Southern education, was that you don't ever quit. I was never under the illusion that racism would disappear. So in many respects, as my father laughed when I went back, he said, they're going to fire you immediately. I said, oh, no, they're not. I said, because I've learned from both of you. I said, I'm not afraid of anything, but you have to be wise about how you deal in these matters. And so they were exemplary for me and my sister, who also became an educator. Michael?
Well, I tell you, I can make a couple of quick comments, but if there are any questions, I'd let the questioners go first, and if there aren't, I'll make my comments. I appreciated what John just said, and I appreciate what Philip said, but I'll come back to that. Let's see if there's any questions for any of the panel.
Very good.
Okay, well, I do have a question. And my question is, Dr. Berkner, you said this, and so did you, Philip, that Mr. Morrow is not mentioned much in terms of history. I myself didn't find out about him until I came to work for the Eisenhower Library. Why do you think that he's not mentioned as much? Particularly, I find it particularly interesting because he's written extensively about his life, and he's made available so many of his papers and his personal documents to the public. So why do you think he's not studied as much? He's not mentioned as much. His research isn't being done on him and his legacy.
Well, that's a good question. I'll respond to that by saying that historians tend to want a dramatic focus, positive or negative. Freddie is mentioned in almost all of the accounts of Eisenhower and civil rights. But he, like I said in my comments earlier, he's mostly in a cameo role. He's on the stage, he's off the stage, and historians tend to emphasize what they want to emphasize about his experience. I don't think they tend to get the nuances of it. So he, number one, wasn't able to make some dramatic breakthrough. The closest that came was with the meeting with the African-American leaders, and there Siciliano got more of the credit. And I think the second reason, and Philip might have another angle on this, but one of the reasons I think he doesn't get as much attention is that his books were not published by academic or commercial presses that would have gotten into the hands of a lot of people. They're hard to find. And one of them was published by a religious house. And as a result, I don't think that a lot of people have read them. I'm going to tell you a personal story. About a decade ago, I wrote to Rutgers University Press director, and I said that Way Down South Up North is a classic, and it should be reintroduced to a modern audience, and I want to do it. I want to edit it, and I want to write an introduction to it. And the editorial director couldn't have been less interested. And I thought Rutgers was just the place where it should have been done. Maybe now people would be more interested. I don't know. But I kind of was dejected by that lack of interest in Fred at that time. Maybe, again, she hadn't read Way Down South Up North and didn't know how good the book is.
Yeah, I also want to add that the civil rights movement is it's a very grassroots movement. The people were marching in the streets. They were organizing in the communities in the South to challenge the legal apparatus of segregation. Fred Morrow is seen as, kind of a G-man, a man as kind of part of that apparatus. And I think it's easy for him to get dismissed as being on the wrong side of the movement. And while all of the leaders were actively working in the South, he has this kind of nice cushy office in DC, and even after his time in the Eisenhower years, he has a nice cushy office in downtown Manhattan, and he's seen as kind of being disconnected from the people, and that's something that he's not the only victim of that. As the civil rights movement progressed, and later on in the late 60s and into the 70s, some of the big leaders at that time were very dismissive of the earlier leaders that were active immediately after World War II and in the 50s. Specifically, the NAACP, which employed Fred Morrow for a number of years, was headed by a man named Walter White for 25 years, and he had a certain guidance under him. When he passed, and the helm was passed on to Roy Wilkins, someone who was very much a contemporary of Fred Morrow, things, went in an immediately different focus. So the work that Fred Morrow was doing in the NAACP with his time there was not necessarily the work that the NAACP was doing 10 to 15 years later. And yeah, Dr. Berkner, I couldn't agree with you more. It's just that his writings don't get, because I don't know if they were published more than one printing, and way down south up north is, it's 100 pages, and like it comes out of a religious press. His final book, which I think is really the most telling, he begins by saying, I have this office in Bank of America. I've been in all these roles, but I am not, when the real decisions are being made, I am not there. And I can be in it as a Black man, I can be in it, but I can never be of it. And I think, John, when you talk about his disillusionment, that line just captures it all. And I think that he deserves to be revisited in future scholarship.
I also want to say, Philip, just in terms of your comment about your regrets that more people haven't used the collection, that I did use it in writing my piece about Fred probably 10 or 12 years ago. And I found it very rich, and I wanted to go back, and a circumstance having to do with a bad weather event prevented me from getting back during an OAH meeting a couple years ago, when I intended to go dig deeper. But I think you've got a lot of great material in your collection for anybody interested, not just in Fred, but in the issues that he touched on. And so we're very lucky that he chose you to put his papers and keep them in good condition for future researchers.
Yeah, and if there are no questions, I would just like to comment. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. These two gentlemen discussing in detail a number of things that I was aware of indirectly as a young person. But Michael and I both know as published scholars that publication can be a very iffy thing depending upon your press and depending upon if they're willing to push it to the public. It's one of those situations, I think, as well. What Philip said is that when Fred was on the ground doing dangerous work for the NAACP, very much as Thurgood Marshall was in those years, that was a situation that often people ignored. They go through a phase. Thurgood Marshall remained in the public eye because he continued to be a lawyer and then went on to the Supreme Court. But Fred chose the political way, which was in line with his inclinations. But one of the things that you come to understand if you're in politics, which is one reason I am not, and my father really was not, is the compromise that you have to make to get things done, especially if you are not in the inner circle, and especially if a lot of people do not want to hear what you've got to say. That is a very difficult situation, and I could completely understand his disillusionment when he said it. And all I thought is that now at the age of 77, today is my birthday. I've been teaching for 50 years in the South, and I'm still teaching because I guess I came to the task with the understanding that as a historian, it's never over. And the struggle continues, and you have to be prepared to keep on with it. He was, but it exhausted him, and it did burn him out.
That's right. Someone said earlier on, I don't know if it was John or Philip, that there was a standing on shoulders of those who come before. And Fred is the person, that the modern civil rights movement will stand, whose shoulders they'll stand on, along with names like Du Bois, of course, and James Weldon Johnson and others you could mention. But in the political sphere, Fred is really a remarkable character. And I think the consensus of this group is that we would understand the dynamics of the civil rights movement better if we understood the travail as well as the triumph of Frederic Morrow better, because he was caught in a very difficult situation and he made the best of it.
Absolutely.
I remember also, in terms of people being forgotten, I remember reading an article a number of years later by an African American who was claiming to be the first Black member of the White House staff. And I was thinking, how easily we forget. And that's another problem that often, if people don't know their history, which is why the three of us are involved and engaged in history, if you don't know your history, you have no idea in hell where you are, where you stand, who has gone before, who you are really benefiting from. And so I was stunned by that, but I also thought, this is what happens if you don't know history. I'll just end on that note, because that's why I became a historian.
So I have one more question, since no one else is jumping in. We talked about this a little bit in some of our other private conversations, but you mentioned that Mr. Morrow was disillusioned, towards the end of his life, and I've said before, many civil rights leaders have written about and talked about the same thing, from Booker T to MLK to Mr. Morrow, that in the end they became very disillusioned about progress. And I'm mentioning that because I like to also make connections to current events. And, Mr. Morrow passes away in 1994, which means he lived through the LA riots. This is pure speculation, but what do you think here in 2021? Do you think how do you think he would feel about progress now? Would he still be as equally disillusioned? Would he think it'd be better, worse? Are we the same? What do you think?
All right, I'll take the bait first. As someone in the Morrow family, I think I share a number of the characteristics of those my ancestors. I think, and I've been in the South for 50 years, I grew up in the South before then. The country has made progress over time and overall. But Fred left, he separated from the party in 1984 when Reagan made his first speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers had been lynched, and was going to continue this Southern strategy. He cut his ties. And all I would say now is that I'm glad he's not alive to witness where the Republican Party, the GOP, has gone, because he used to talk about it being the party of Lincoln and then becoming the party of Reagan. Right now, it's being led by a coterie of people that are far beyond conservative. If they're not reactionary, they're white nationalists, Nazis. That's the cutting edge of the party. And he would be, I'm appalled. I try to hold my tongue when people ask me that, but I'll just say that. I can't imagine. He's probably turning over in his grave right now. But I would hope he wouldn't lose the longer sense of things, that we actually have made progress. This is a reaction to all the progress we've made.
Most of what I would say would really supplement John's good comments. I think that Fred would have been very proud of the achievements of African Americans in so many different fields, including academia and obviously public policy and medicine and law, and go on and on and on. But I think the biggest feeling he would have would be, just as John put it, a great sense of despair that a party that he had pledged his trust to in the 1930s as the party of Lincoln. I mean, he was a young Republican activist during the New Deal, during the Roosevelt era, that a party he believed in. And by the way, into the 1960s, the Republican Party was much more pro-civil rights, certainly in the Northeast, than the Democratic Party was in the South and elsewhere in the country. And to see the Republican Party embrace a Southern strategy, stay with the Southern strategy, and then engage in, essentially white grievance in the last few years, I think would have been very discouraging to Fred, because I think he believes in the original Lincoln idea of a fair field for all and opportunity for all. And I think that was what he thought the Republican Party stood for, and it becomes something else.
I have nothing more to add. I think John and Michael have said it the best, and I completely agree with what you both have said.
All right. Well, thank you so much. If there aren't any other questions, we're going to wrap this up. All right. So today's program is sponsored by the Eisenhower Foundation with generous support from the Jeff Koch Foundation. Our next program is our inaugural World War II Emerging Scholars Symposium, which will begin on Tuesday, June 1st, and will continue until June 4th. Continue daily. The June Evenings at Ease program will feature Dr. Alan Millett from the University of New Orleans, and will continue our discussion on World War II. Our next Lunch and Learn is going to take a look at FDR and the 4 freedoms. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next program. And thank you, gentlemen. We really appreciate your scholarship and your contributions. This has been a phenomenal program.